25,000. That is not a statistic. That is a disappearance. Every single month, Russia is losing between 20 and 25,000 soldiers in Ukraine. Not wounded, not missing, dead. Let that sit. In the 1980s, during the Afghan War, the Soviet Union lost 20,000 troops in 10 years. Now, the same number vanishes in 1 month. And yet, the war continues. Factories run around the clock. Missiles keep flying. Drones keep coming. Territory gained? Barely 5,000 square kilometers, less than 1% of Ukraine. This is not momentum. This is friction. I want you to pause here, because if these numbers don't shock you, nothing about modern war will. Stay with me, because what looks like brute force on the surface hides a far more dangerous mechanism underneath. Do you see it yet? This war is often described as a test of endurance, but endurance for whom? On one side, Ukraine, fighting to survive. On the other, Russia, bleeding at a scale modern Europe has not seen in decades. The key question is not whether Russia can keep fighting tomorrow. It is whether this system can function next year and the year after that. Because losing 20 to 25,000 soldiers every month is not a battlefield outcome. It is a structural condition. A war where deaths are routine, where replacement becomes policy, where territory gained is measured in fractions, but lives lost are counted in tens of thousands. And still, Moscow presses forward. Missiles, drones, strikes on energy infrastructure, winter as a weapon. This tells us something crucial. This conflict is no longer about quick victory. It is about grinding time itself. And to understand where this leads, we have to step backward into history. Russia has fought wars like this before, not with speed, not with elegance, but with scale. In the 1980s, the Soviet war in Afghanistan dragged on year after year. Losses mounted slowly. Pain accumulated quietly, and the system absorbed it until it didn't. That comparison matters because today Russia is burning through the same number of dead soldiers in 1 month that once took a decade. This is not a failure of courage. It is a feature of a strategy built on mass, a belief that time favors the side willing to lose more, a belief that production lines can outlast public memory, a belief that human cost is manageable as long as it is spread. But modern war has changed the math. Precision weapons, drones, satellite visibility. Every loss is faster. Every mistake is louder. And yet the old logic remains, which raises a dangerous question. What happens when an outdated strategy collides with an unforgiving reality? That collision is already underway. The first rupture is no longer theoretical. It is visible on the battlefield. Since January 2024, Russian forces have pushed forward and gained about 5,000 square kilometers. On paper, that sounds like movement. In reality, it is less than 1% of Ukraine. Now look at the cost. Nearly 1 million total casualties, up to 250,000 killed. This is the imbalance. A war where the price explodes, but the outcome barely shifts. That is what makes this moment unstable, because systems can tolerate loss, but they cannot tolerate meaningless loss. To compensate, Russia escalates elsewhere. Missiles strike Kyiv, drones target energy grids, power stations go dark, heating fails as temperatures drop below freezing. This is pressure by exhaustion, not aimed at the front line, but at civilian endurance. And here is the uncomfortable truth. When progress stalls, violence does not stop, it migrates. Because what comes next is not visible on the battlefield. What we are witnessing is not chaos, it is a mechanism. Russia is no longer fighting for rapid breakthroughs. It is running a machine that converts industrial output into pressure. Factories operate around the clock. Missiles are replenished. Drones are launched in waves. Human loss becomes an input, not an exception. This is why the casualty numbers matter less inside the system than they do outside it. Because as long as production continues, the war continues. And when battlefield gains remain marginal, the strategy shifts from territory to infrastructure, electricity, heating, energy networks. By striking these systems, Russia is not trying to win land. It is trying to erode resilience, to make normal life impossible, to turn winter into leverage. But this model carries a hidden flaw. It assumes endurance is infinite, that society can absorb loss without fracture, that escalation will force submission before collapse arrives. History suggests otherwise. And when this mechanism begins to fail, it does not slow down, it lashes out. That is the danger now unfolding. The second rupture comes when escalation meets resistance. Despite relentless strikes, Ukraine holds. The front lines shift slowly. Civilian systems are damaged, but not broken. So the pressure intensifies. Missiles, drones, repeated waves, targeting Dnipro, Zhytomyr, Zaporizhia, Kharkiv, Kherson, energy facilities, critical infrastructure, again and again. This is not random. It is a signal that battlefield leverage is insufficient, that time is no longer neutral, and the world is watching. At the United Nations, the United States calls this a dangerous and inexplicable escalation, not because it is shocking, but because it is predictable. When a war cannot end decisively, it expands horizontally, across cities, across civilians, across borders of tolerance. This is the moment wars become harder to stop, because each strike locks in the next response. Each blackout deepens resolve on one side and urgency on the other. From here, the conflict is no longer contained. It is transmitted. And the people who feel it first are not soldiers. This is where the war reaches you, not as a headline, not as a map, but as darkness. You are not on the front line. You are at home. And suddenly, the lights go out. Heating stops. Phones lose signal. Temperatures fall below freezing. This is not collateral damage. This is design. Hundreds of thousands of civilians are left without electricity, without warmth, without certainty. And here is the cruelest part. You are not being targeted for what you did, but for what you endure. The strategy assumes that suffering will speak louder than resistance, that exhaustion will finish what weapons cannot. But history shows something else. People adapt. Communities improvise. Resolve hardens. And every blackout carries a message back to the attacker. This did not break us. If you are still watching, it means you understand something fundamental. This war is no longer about territory. It is about human limits. Because the consequences do not stop at Ukraine's borders. What happens in Ukraine does not stay in Ukraine. This war has become a signal fire for the global system. NATO watches closely because this is no longer a regional conflict. It is a test of how much loss a state can absorb, a test of whether industrial warfare can overpower resistance, a test of how far escalation can go before the system pushes back. That is why NATO's Secretary General calls Russia the most significant long-term threat, not because of one battle, but because of the pattern. Round-the-clock weapons production, persistent aggression, no visible off-ramp. Every missile strike forces recalculation. Every blackout sharpens alliances. Every escalation narrows diplomatic space. And once that space disappears, wars stop being managed and start being endured. This is how local conflicts reshape global order, not through sudden collapse, but through slow normalization of violence. The danger is not that this war spreads overnight. The danger is that the world learns to live with it, and when that happens, the rules quietly change. The final question then is not what happens next week. It is what kind of future this logic produces. From here, the war moves into uncertainty. But uncertainty still has structure. There are three possible paths. The first is stabilization. Losses remain high, but escalation slows. The front lines harden. The war becomes frozen, not resolved, but contained. A long conflict managed through endurance, not victory. The second path is normalization of attrition. Monthly losses of 20 to 25,000 soldiers become routine. Infrastructure strikes continue. Territory shifts marginally. The system adapts to constant sacrifice. This is the most dangerous scenario because it turns abnormal violence into background noise. Then there is the third path, systemic strain. When casualties approach limits that production and society cannot replace, when nearly 1 million total casualties stop being abstract, when escalation no longer creates leverage, only exposure. At that point, something breaks. Not predictably, not cleanly. History rarely tells us which pressure point will fail first, but it always tells us this: wars built on attrition do not end because one side wins. They end because the system can no longer pretend the cost is acceptable. Which future emerges depends less on weapons and more on endurance. This war strips away one illusion, that modern conflict is about speed or precision or decisive victories. What Ukraine shows us instead is a war powered by tolerance for loss. 20,000 to 25,000 soldiers dead every month, nearly 1 million total casualties, for gains measured in fractions of territory. This is not strategy as brilliance, it is strategy as endurance. And that is why this conflict matters far beyond the battlefield. Because a world that normalizes this logic is a world where cost no longer constrains power, where escalation becomes routine, where suffering is processed, not prevented. The question is not whether this war ends. All wars do. The question is, what kind of system survives it? One that learns limits or one that learns indifference? If you watch this far, you already know the answer matters, because the next war will not begin with explosions. It will begin with the belief that this one was sustainable.